Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Okay. Welcome to Saginaw Valley State University. Excited to have you all here. My name is George Grant Jr. I'm the president of this great university. So, yes. We also have in the audience our former president, President Eric Giberson and his wife. So they're both here, so I want to acknowledge them. Yeah. So this is the annual Dr. Raana Akbar Memorial Lecture Series. And what's exciting about this is that it's the opportunity to learn. I think as a university, as an institution of higher education, that we have the opportunity to bring different voices together, to bring people together, to understand what's happening in our own community, around the country, and around the world. And so this lecture series provides us the opportunity to do that. And our Dr. Akbar, who was a medical doctor and who was passionate. She was passionate about education. She was passionate about learning from others, learning different cultures, and having the opportunity to make a difference by communicating with each other. And as we communicated, as we get to talk to each other, that we find that the differences are not that wide, and that was her passion. And so for her husband, Dr. Akbar, he wanted to establish something in her honor. And so this lecture series, which started in 2011, is in her honor. So tonight, we are here to learn. First, we're here to listen, then to learn, to ask questions, and to get to know each other better. So with that, please welcome Dr. Akbar.
Good evening. Begin with the name of God, the most merciful, the most beneficent. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you. Thank you, Dr. Grant, for those wonderful remarks. As it was mentioned, this was a series which was started 13 years ago after Raana passed away. Kind help of Dr. Eric Gilbertson, who's here today, and thank you for being here, Eric and Cindy, that we discussed what would be the best way to remember Raana and her legacy. So we thought the best way would be to start this lecture series because we as Muslims quite often feel that the representation in media and otherwise of a religion is not what we would like people to know about it, because really the reality is totally different. And we always felt it is our responsibility to bring more information to people who we live with on a daily basis. This evening, we have a special speaker, Dr. David Nichols, we announce in a minute. Thank you for all of you being here. I know some of you may be new. I see a lot of friends and familiar faces, and I'm grateful that you took the time from your busy schedules and this beautiful weather to be here. I would like to again thank President Grant for ongoing support. This series couldn't be successful without his support. And the wonderful staff we have at SVSU, which helps us organize, does all the work in the media, the printing, and organizing this evening. Our university, Saginaw Valley State University, continues on a path of success with great leadership and ongoing support from our very generous community. The foundation is doing wonderful work, and we keep on giving enormous amount, almost record amount of scholarships to the students who need support. This year's, like the previous years, couldn't have been arranged without my close friend, Dr. David Nichols, and I really appreciate his help, assistance, guidance, and above all, his friendship. He's extremely well organized and keeps also me in line to make sure we do everything correctly. I would also like to say, I know I always embarrass her, but I'm going to do it again, Jennifer Liu, my niece, who for the first 5 to 7 years literally held my hand, did all the work needed to bring it as a starting an event where it is today. And then David has been helpful in continuing it. Raana and I felt very strongly that American Muslims need to bring the message of peace to our friends and fellow citizens, and this is an ongoing effort to do that. I will end by a quote, which is anonymous. "Learning till the last breath is a life well lived." Thank you. I'd like to request Dr. David Nichols.
Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight, and thank you for those who are joining us online. I am David Nichols. I teach in the philosophy department here at SVSU, and very proud to be part of this Akbar lecture series. I hope you will check out the webpage, and there's information on the program that you probably received when you were coming in. Also, there will be a book signing after the talk, and I hope you will join us for that, and Fareed Ben-Youssef will be happy to sign your book and regardless to meet you. I wanted to say something about our speaker and why it was important for us to bring him here today. So Fareed Ben-Youssef is assistant professor in film and media at Texas Tech University. He has a PhD in film and media from the University of California, Berkeley. His previous degrees are an MA in Film Studies program in rhetoric at UC Berkeley, and also a BA in English literature with a film concentration from Berkeley. His book, No Jurisdiction, The Law and Post-9/11 Genre Cinema, came out with SUNY Press in 2022. When Wahid and I were considering who to invite for this year, he handed me a copy of the book. Read this. And I did, and I was impressed. And I think you will be impressed too. He has manuscripts in progress, though. There will be books coming soon. The War on Terror Comes to Paris, Operation Sentinelle in Contemporary French Cinema, and also his other manuscript in progress, The Cinema of Ryosuke Hamaguchi in the Shadow of Quiet Apocalypse. Evidence that he is interested in far more than Hollywood film. He is well-versed in all kinds of different global genres. Fareed has published many scholarly articles on film. These are not limited to American film. He has organized many university film series. He has hosted classes with award-winning directors. His many awards include Fulbright scholarships, various research fellowships, and just recently, an Excellence in Research Award for the Humanities at Texas Tech University, which comes as no surprise for anyone who reads his work. Now, a word about the book, No Jurisdiction. No Jurisdiction explores how film changed in a post-9/11 era, so that Hollywood redefines the villain, the hero, landscapes are realized differently, the collective anxieties of American culture crystallize into images that we can love and hate on screen. And something that was particularly appealing to me about this book was a kind of oscillation that takes place between real-world events, if you will, and fantastical images of the screen, back and forth, in such a way that their interwoven realities are not easily discernible. Meanwhile, Fareed observes how in film we portray the other. That's special intellectual talk for philosophers and others, to identify something like the farthest margin in your comfort radius. Those people in the society that make you feel uncomfortable, maybe they have faces that look different from your faces. And in a post 9/11 world, maybe those are brown faces. And in a COVID-19 world, maybe they're Asian faces. And this idea of the other is a very deep traditional notion. It takes us all the way back to the prophets, for instance, who have this notion of the importance of the marginalized people in society, whether it's the widow or the orphan, the people who have been captured in war. That justice requires us to take inventory of them, not to take those faces and villainize them, to dominate them, to hypersexualize them, and all those things that are the worst instances in our films to this day. But rather to reach out to them and to realize that there's something powerful about our own humanity and those people at the margins. And so No Jurisdiction is a book not just about film. It's a book about humanity and how we see others, how we have images, how we take responsibility for our images. And why does film resonate with us so easily? What is it about film? One answer, I think, is that film is storytelling. And storytelling is essential to the development of human consciousness. My 11-year-old son begs me every night, literally begs me to tell him a story. Dad, please tell me another story. I have to think throughout the day, what story am I going to tell my son tonight? Why is that? What we're doing here at the university, I believe it in the sciences and the arts, is still and always will be narration. The human being is a story. Fareed is here to help us think harder about how we handle our stories, to recognize the power of the images, to deconstruct and reconstruct those moving images. That's why we've invited him here, because he has something very important to say. Would you please join me in welcoming Fareed Ben-Youssef and his talk, The Beauty and the Horror, Sensing the Muslim as Enemy and as Superhero in Post-9/11 Film.
Hello, everyone. I can't really see you, so I'll assume that you're liking this. My general vibe, I want to sort of open up with my own set of thank yous. First, I want to thank everyone that's here today. I'm so excited to share some of my thoughts with you and to, most importantly, get a conversation going between us. I can't wait to hear your questions, how this resonates with you, because ultimately what I'm interested in is how the movies resonate with us on the most spectacular movies, the most larger-than-life movies. I'm interested in how they resonate with us on the deepest of personal levels. And I know I have family and friends and students watching this recording, so I'm very excited to have their virtual presence in the room as well. And I look forward to your questions in person and online, or cogitations that might come up from this talk. And the kind words you heard, I think, merit thanks as well to my hosts, in addition to the wonderful Dr. Grant and the administration. I'd like to specifically thank my hosts, Dr. Waheed Akbar and Professor David Nichols, who offered such kind words. I would be remiss to say that I've received the Fulbright Alternate Award several times. So just for everyone's general knowledge, it's something we're still pursuing. But Waheed reached out to me about such a lecture, and the invitation was particularly touching. You see, he has a place of privilege in my family's story as a witness to my parents' intimate wedding in New York City in 1977. To hear how he read and appreciated my book on post-9/11 genre film, No Jurisdiction, from which much of the talk derives, made me feel as if he was witnessing with kindness and compassion the latest chapter in my immigrant family's American story, where I have been pondering, what does it mean to be a disabled Arab American of French-Tunisian descent who grew up in eastern Montana, who loves, and I mean absolutely loves, Hollywood movies, that just might not love people like me back. And so I'm also thankful to be invited by Wahid's collaborator, David, who was so generous in all his efforts, especially in working with me to find a topic that opens newer films to the kind of personal and political analysis that marks no jurisdiction. If you read it, it's as much an autobiography of my experience with these exhilarating and troubling movies and my own past in Montana pre and post 9/11, as much as it is an analysis. And David, I can assure you that my press, SUNY press in this case, as tickled as they are by this book talk, may have started to push me towards a book inspired by this talk already. One that deals with the impressive and terrifying sandworm creatures of Denis Villeneuve's Dune series of cinematic adaptations. So when we talk afterwards, let me know if you want me to talk more about the wonderful works of Timothée Chalamet. I'm curious for an informal poll. And it is also an honor to be a part of this series dedicated to the memory of Dr. Raana Akbar. I had not had the privilege to meet her, though I was able to hear much from my father, who's merrily attending today, Salut Baba, and as well as from Wahid and the people that knew Raana. And I can see how special she is. The SVSU President Emeritus Eric Gilbertson, who's here today, lauded Dr. Akbar for her dedication to not only her family, community, and the university, but for her investment in wanting to shed light on Islam. Like Dr. Akbar, President Gilbertson reminds us, quote, "We are all just fellow searchers for truth," end quote. In that spirit, I want to ask tonight, what truths can we uncover about Islam and about Arab Americans in that most spectacular of settings, Hollywood movies? How might we search for truth in a cinematic kaleidoscope where we might see ourselves and our personal and cultural experiences inflected, yes, but also distorted by the prejudiced views that bubble up in the public and political arenas? I am so delighted to be with you all as we mull these questions. Next slide. This talk will trace the portrayals of the Muslim and Arab in Hollywood since 9/11, looking at literal portrayals of Muslims as terrorists, as in the 9/11 reenactment, United 93, by Paul Greengrass, to more metaphoric ones, as in the desert-dwelling freedom fighters of Villeneuve's aforementioned Dune series. I ask, where is our Western cinematic mythology about Muslims taking us? Are Muslims the enemy? Are they our heroes, super or otherwise? Are they examples of POC fans caught in Hollywood's glamour and in its visions that twist their views on themselves so that they learn to love the very military apparatus which targets them? Are they an example of a new anti-colonial future? Could they be all of these things? And if so, where do we viewers stand? What lesson does this stew of representations, spiced with contradictory flavors that can unsettle the palate, offer us all in how we might become more skeptical, savvy viewers able to find in our mass media discomforting and empowering truths about ourselves and those that are often labeled the enemy? So to begin to answer these questions, it is worth underlining that Hollywood is not just a dream factory, but is instead a site of soft power for the American state. Next slide. As described by political theorist Joseph Nye, soft power is a mode of control which occurs when one country gets other countries to want what it wants. In his foreign policy article formalizing the concept, Nye uses the analogy of one lover manipulating another. Soft power rests on a love redirected and controlled. He describes how a nation hopes to coerce others, acts like a parent seeking to mold their teenage child. Love in the non-American subject is sparked by, quote, intangible power resources, such as culture, ideology, and institutions, end quote. And Nye emphasizes that, quote, if its culture and ideology are attractive, others will more willingly follow, end quote. America's transnational and pervasive popular culture creates a shimmer that draws in the global public, encouraging them to move in step with the United States. And such a process has human consequences. Nye quotes Rafe Dorentorth, who asserts that people are prepared to, quote, risk their lives to migrate to America, end quote. And with a certain callousness, Nye then concludes, maintaining this appeal is important, end quote. Soft power through entertainment fosters love in the consumers, creating, in Nye's estimation, children of them who are willing to give themselves up for their beloved adopted nation. Encountering Nye, I have to tell you, was kind of uncomfortable, for it made me reflect on my own gusto for Hollywood, feeling that I may be losing something of myself in my frequent baths in its latest concoctions. Next slide. Soft power was foundational to the War on Terror's introduction and maintenance by the Bush administration. Adopting the language of a Western sheriff when starting the War on Terror, George W. Bush announced his intent to find Osama bin Laden, quote, I want justice. Forgive my impressions, there's going to be a lot. I'm working with a mask here, I got to do what I got to do. Quote, let's return to, what did George W. Bush say? I want justice. And there's an old poster out west, I recall, that says, wanted, dead or alive, end quote. To make the abstract war against a transnational enemy convincing and comprehensible, and this kind of resonates with, David, your idea of the importance of storytelling. I argue in No Jurisdiction that Bush framed the conflict in terms of a Western movie. Bush's political strategists met with Hollywood executives shortly after the attacks in November 2001. They were said to discuss, quote, the war on terrorism and the ways Hollywood stars and films might work in concert in ways both formal and informal with the administration's communication strategy, end quote. The war on terror was strategically envisioned in genre terms. And when I mean genre, I mean the set storytelling types of movies, like in this case, the Western. And its leaders were deeply aware of how Hollywood's cultural productions could help spread its message. Such speeches and meetings occurred around the passing of UN Security Council Resolution 1373, which mandated that all UN member states needs to change their laws to fight transnational terrorism. During the War on Terror's opening stages, where the war was made global, hard power worked in concert with soft. Next slide. Growing up in eastern Montana as the son of immigrant cinephiles, I often encountered Hollywood co-opted as a tool of soft power by the US government following 9/11. For years, my local movie theater would screen Chuck Workman's The Spirit of America prior to all feature presentations. Workman's 3-minute film, produced immediately following the attacks, presents iconic sequences from Hollywood history. With its glamorizing shots of Matt Damon as a grizzled soldier, would make my skeptical Baba roll his eyes. He's here, so we can ask him if this is actually true. He was tired of the jingoism on display, and I sympathized with his frustration. In the time when the country marched into war against Near Eastern populations, it was disheartening to see the cinematic entertainments that we both love reduced, or at least nakedly exposed, to be nothing but ideological weapons. Hollywood's reenactments of 9/11, in line with the wide-eyed tone of Workman's short films about Hollywood, seem to be uncritical celebrations of America and its undiminished, and to emphasize, uncritical spirit in a time of crisis. One film, notably in particular, exemplifies the vision of the Muslim as terrorist enemy. Paul Greengrass's United 93. Next slide. United 93, let's see. This is not the, United 93 traffics heavily in visions of the terrorist enemy as stereotypically Arab and quintessentially Muslim. Greengrass presents a reenactment of United Airlines Flight 93, where passengers allegedly resisted hijackers until the moment of the crash. The film recounts much of the story chronologically in real time. It opens with a recitation from the Quran, the words heard first against a blank screen and then against a tight shot of the Holy Book. You see it there at the top. The recitation continues over images of New York City. The unsubtitled verse sounds like an incantation to those who don't speak Arabic that looms menacingly over this metropolitan space. A supposedly incomprehensible Islamic threat thus floats above, permeating the American setting. In this way, Al-Qaeda members are reduced to their religious beliefs, acting without what might be considered to be any political logic. And soon, the set design emulates an imagined radical Islamist view of the United States. Next slide. Several of the hijackers enter the airport, passing by a pair of fake fashion magazine covers, the Shape issue and the Bust issue, each of which features a seductively posed woman, one of them with a phallic popsicle resting on her lips. Now, although the shot lasts only a second, it frames the enemy's perception of American media as prurient and obsessed with the female body. The set decoration, featuring such objectified hypersexual femininity, implies that these enemies are driven either by misogyny or by regressive attitudes about the sex and the body. Next slide. United 93's camera operates with an eerie prescience, continually falling on the Arab hijackers even before the plane takes off, visually engaging in a kind of racial profiling. Greengrass's docudrama, where history seems inevitable, leaves little room for nuance. Next slide. United 93 also points to the wider history of the Arab as an enemy. I'm sure you have other examples, I'd be curious. In the popular imagination, he had long signaled fanatical menace in Hollywood films, such as 1977's Black Sunday, 1985's Back to the Future, True Lies from 94, The Siege, 98, and Rules of Engagement in 2000. Next slide. Following 9/11, the Arab has been represented as an enemy, not only in the geopolitical world and reenactments like United 93, but also popular fantastical movies. The animated television program South Park gestures to how entrenched the archetype of the Arab's terrorist is in a 2007 story called Imagination Land, where terrorists attack the titular site, the literal home of humanity's imagination. The show underlines how the figure of the terrorizing Arab has taken control of the imagination of Hollywood. Next slide. For instance, villains from the desert land of Mordor in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings are dressed in robes that evoke the stereotypical image of Bedouins. Next slide. South Park itself reinforces this reading by presenting contemporary Arab terrorists rushing amok in Mordor in America's, or towards Mordor, in America's imagination land. Next slide. The superhero film Iron Man from 2008 reduces Middle Eastern men to cannon fodder for the superhero, an embodiment, I argue, of the American drone program. With perfect aim, Iron Man separates the civilians from the enemies. The latter do not even get a label in his electronic sights. They are nameless, killable objects existing without clear definition, like the enemy combatants of post-9/11 law. The hostages, meanwhile, are momentarily frozen amid the bodies. They look in horror at the American source of their salvation. End quote. End quote. Next slide. Seconds later, the hero throws a hiding fighter out of a hotel lobby. As he does so, a hotel sign briefly appears in the shot that features the English misspelling "bad drown." Well, this is ostensibly a misspelling of bedroom. Given the abundant Middle Eastern stereotypes on display, I view it as a portmanteau of bad brown. The scene acknowledges its own stereotyping logic and reveals just for a moment the human devastation of America's war on terror, fought through the machine eye of the drone. Do these pop dreams that I love watching, and, as we see here, which sometimes seem to admit to their own regressive logics, only offer me visions of my own inhumanity? How can I make sense of my torn allegiance between the heroes and their enemies? And how can I manage to genuinely love these films? That's right, everyone, I love Iron Man. So I want to, as we get deeper into the muck, know that it is the muck of the thing that makes me love it more. So I'm not saying don't watch these things. I'm saying get in closer. Get in closer to what you love, what moves you, and what troubles you. And you start to see something new. It starts to gain new, unsettling, and enriching aspects. But to help answer these implicating questions regarding my love, it's striking that the spectacular genre films in the past decades push beyond the brown-bad binary to feature individuals like me, POC fans of the superhero. Next slide. An early example of the brown superhero fan occurs in the film The Dark Knight Rises from 2012 by Christopher Nolan. In an early scene, a brown orphan child, speaking with the detective and eventual Batman ally, John Blake, asks if the long-missing hero will ever return to the city. The boy obsessively carves a Batman symbol in chalk as he gestures towards the lack of state support as youth age out of his underfunded boys' home. The symbol of the superhero resonates with the abandoned brown boy. And in the years since 2012 and The Dark Knight Rises, we have seen examples of black, brown, and explicitly Muslim youth who are superhero fans. And in the case with the elastic Ms. Marvel, also known as Kamala Khan, superheroes themselves. They are not seeking an alternative to an uncaring state, as in The Dark Knight Rises. Rather, they act to put them in Nye's terms as potential manipulated lovers of the state power, for which such heroes are often spectacular proxies. The Marvel Cinematic Universe goes into jingoistic terrain as it presents us with wide-eyed examples of POC and Muslim fans of superheroes. In 2019's Captain Marvel, we find an ecstatic celebration of the superhero as a military ideal for a child. Following the adventures of the Air Force pilot Carol Danvers, transformed into a godlike being, the scene shows us the protagonist chatting with the young daughter of a former comrade. Danvers playfully frames the girl as a little soldier in training by calling her by her nickname, Lieutenant Trouble. Then she makes a request. The child is asked to choose the new colors of her alien costume, as she is, in her words, quote, the only person around here with any sense of style. Let's watch this scene before I continue. Please go to the clip. Fresh. Danvers moves to stand, as we saw, on the stoop of the girl's home, presenting the gauntlet on her arm and its keypad to the girl to shift the costume's colors. The girl, named Monica, fluctuates through a whole number of bright possibilities, rejecting all, laughing and revealing how the superhero pushes her fan towards the military end. Captain Marvel looks down at the girl's shirt and exclaims, quote, "Well, since we are all on the same team." The camera pans to the blue and white logo of the Air Force on her shirt before moving back up to show the girl smiling with understanding. Once the colors of the military brand spill over her costume, the camera moves from a tight mid shot on Captain Marvel to a wide shot of both. The superhero appears fully illuminated at the center of the frame, but her young acolyte lies deeper in the nighttime shadow, visually lost for a moment against the brilliant fusion between divine superpower and the American military. Next slide. And for our interests in the representation of the Muslim, the sequel, 2023's The Marvels, presents the Muslim superfan, the aforementioned Ms. Marvel, aka Kamala Khan. First seen in the streaming series by the same name as her superhero title, the teenage Kamala not only has a Muslim family, but Muslim friends in the form of her BFF, Nakia Bahadir. In the series, as critic Catherine Singh explains, there are moments where the hijab-wearing friend explains the struggle of, quote, growing up between two cultures, end quote, and how her hijab makes her feel, quote, like me, like I have a purpose, end quote. Singh positively praises the scene for equating, quote, Nakia's hijab and identity with Kamala's superpowers, reframing a religious head covering often vilified in Western cultures in a positive and powerful light, as many of those who actually wear one have always seen, end quote. Next slide. At the start of her first movie appearance in The Marvels, we see Kamala's room where the object of adulation, Captain Marvel, in the form of a cardboard cutout, is positioned against and slightly in front of the portrait of her hijab-wearing friend Nakia. The military superhero slightly usurps the markers of her kin as a Muslim American. And when the camera pans out from the wall, it shows Kamala doodling out an adventure with her hero. She then slams the door, muting her mother calling out for her, so that she can focus all of her attention on her beloved captain. Now, before I continue my discussion, let's watch that scene.
The Avengers need backup, you know? This is my chance. Not bad, kid. What's your name? Miss Marvel? Dune. Twinsy. Hey, you wanna go party with the Avengers? Yeah. Oh, can you fly? No, but, I can do this. That does not sound like science to me. Okay!
Don't you find you just want to keep watching? You're like, I forgot. No, we have a talk. As we have seen, the shot of her doodled adventures, animated in the film, show us an ecstatic teenager fawning over the stern former Air Force pilot. Next slide. How Kamala's love of the hero may blind her to her vulnerability to state surveillance and control in our present post-9/11 moment occurs after a fight scene where Captain Marvel and she keep switching places across space and time in a battle that ultimately leaves Kamala's home in ruins. The family silently tries to clean up the debris and are confronted by a military party seeking Danvers, parties who show no concern about the state of the home. Kamala grows delighted about the interest of the state upon her. In her mind, it validates her position as a superhero. Walking on the rubble and holding her top secret file, she exclaims, quote, "Can you believe it? They have intel on me. I am intel." End quote. Her mother turns towards the agent, her brow furrowed with concern, and she asks, quote, "Why do you have intel on her? Is there some sort of surveillance on us?" End quote. Kamala's father nods with shared angst. The government agent, which now includes a grown-up Monica, who herself is a superpowered soldier, tries to assuage her fears by saying, quote, "Surveillance is a strong word," end quote. The Muslim American immigrants in the scene, I should note the older generation, approach a reality in which they are the object of top secret intelligence. They approach that reality with anxiety, unease, paranoia, and concern. What of Kamala? Her only regret in the scene is stated simply as, quote, "I cannot believe Captain Marvel was here, and I didn't get to meet her. You know, we were supposed to be all like twinsies," end quote. Kamala potently frames how much icons of soft power can subordinate the Muslim American, even a superpowered one. Any of the fear and suspicion of her family about being a part of a potentially targeted class of Americans falls into a kind of dead angle in light of her great ardor and glee for the military superhero, her imagined twinsy. The scene brings to mind the warning introduced by the influential post-colonial thinker Frantz Fanon in his book Black Skin, White Masks, who warns of the impact of the pop culture of the metropole, the center of the colonial empire, warning of the impact of, quote, Tarzan stories, the saga of 12-year-old explorers, the adventures of Mickey Mouse, and all those comic books, end quote. The psychiatrist argues that the work carries a perverse dimension in which the racially marginalized subject of empire comes to, quote, subjectively adopt a white man's attitude in an act permeated with sadism, end quote, and ultimately psychically obliterates themselves. So, does Kamala's joy at being an object of government intel suggest how much she sees the world with a white man's attitude? Ignorant to the threats towards her brownness, towards a world of extraordinary rendition, indefinite detention, and total surveillance? The scenes in the Marvels inspire such a question. However, before we move toward more messianic portrayals of Muslim-coded heroes, I want to stress that for me and other POC fans beyond the aforementioned scene, these potentially tainted tales offer vital vehicles for representation. Ahmed Ali Akbar, Dr. Akbar's son, wrote a very resonant article in Akeya magazine, quote, called 2 Decades of Muslims as Mutants, where he reflected on his long love of the X-Men and other Marvel superheroes. As a Muslim American, he found the portrayals of stigmatized superheroes to be potent analogs for himself. He writes, quote, "The popular Marvel superheroes of my childhood were recluses, outcasts, or loners. They were awkward, they struggled with demons. I was them, and they were me," end quote. And for me, Fareed, this bleeding of identity is of interest because of how such icons speaks not only to our victimhood, but more discomfortingly, our complicity with broader systems of oppression. For a privileged subject like myself, these heroes show, to quote the French poet Charles Baudelaire, who I mention in my book, "Je suis bourreau et victime. I am both victim and executioner." Or, executioner and victim. While Ahmed does not explore the question of complicity, he offers a very resonant formulation, saying that Muslim fans, quote, "like myself, breathed our own spirit into the margins," end quote. This line potently reminds us of our power as marginalized subjects to reshape and reframe the seemingly empty comic book stories that so troubled Fanon. If Ahmed asks where he finds himself in the X-Men, I ask, where am I in Batman? Who am I to the white billionaire alter ego that is Bruce Wayne? Next slide. Oh, this slide. Keep the slide. Let's go back. Hey. So 2023's Blue Beetle, where a son of the Latinx family gains remarkable abilities, offers a moment where I could breathe myself and my always skeptical spirit into the margins of the blockbuster. Therein, the working class family tastes superheroic power, an expression and an experience potentially antithetical to their radical politics. And testifying to this contradiction, at the later stages of the film, a grandma who had a revolutionary past in Central America yells, quote, "Down with imperialists," end quote. Earlier in the film, as we see here, a conspiracy-oriented uncle declares, Batman's fascist. Is to be a superhero, to want to be close to him, a challenge to my own radical anti-imperialist politics? Does loving superheroes like Batman mean flirting with fascism? Superheroes, for me, are essential for their disruptive potential, to show me in all their exhilaration how intoxicating and unbounded a imperialist and fascist philosophy might be. How susceptible I am to a system that may not want me. Next slide. I may not be like the pictured skeptical fan presented in the film Black Adam from 2022, which is set in an occupied Palestine-like nation where a superhero-loving boy rallies against neo-imperial subjugation. Secretly, just between us. I may just be like Kamala, wishing against hope that Batman and I might be twinsies. The very foregrounding of my repulsive internal division in my own allegiances is why I find these kinds of stories not just entertainment. I find them essential. Next slide. The films themselves seem marked by a division in allegiance, a point growing more apparent as we move farther away from 9/11. Many of the films feature a striking anti-colonial strand in which we can glimpse empires being built in the Middle East. We see their fracture points, and we come to sympathize with heroes in some films who strive to break them. This strand is present even in films that traffic in crude stereotypes of the Arab, such as Wonder Woman 1984, seen here, where we are shown an unctuous oil emir, referred to as the, quote, king of crude, in a briefly glimpsed magazine. Next slide. Ironically, even as the film was criticized for the casting of Gal Gadot, a former IDF soldier, it allegorizes the Israel-West Bank barrier with surprising nuance. Following the answer of the emir's wish for a homeland free of, quote, heathens, by the film's supervillain, a wall suddenly appears. A news report announces, quote, a truly bizarre phenomenon that is being called the Divine Wall. Egypt's poorest community is now entirely cut off from their only supply of fresh water, end quote. In the film, Arabs are trapped, and the film presents the walls that enclose them as being created by supervillains. In the film, a jingoistic racist narrative leads viewers, like myself, towards real-life human rights abuses. What Amnesty International describes as, quote, the occupation of water and Israel's discriminatory policies on Palestinian access to adequate supplies of clean and fresh water, end quote. Films that draw us all in, even in their most propagandistic form, can push us to ponder difficult settler colonial realities in the Middle East and beyond. Next slide. but in an ultimate example for how much these films can offer a critical perspective towards the kinds of neo-imperial realities of our post-9/11 world, to see Arab-coded figures not as terrorists but as freedom fighters, we need look no further than Villeneuve's acclaimed Dune series. The filmmaker, who had previously depicted the homecoming of war on terror policy throughout his works, including the border western Sicario, which prominently features in my book, and which shows drones flying over the US-Mexico border. He creates some of the sharpest portrayals of a Middle East being exploited for their resources that I have seen in popular filmmaking. Next slide. With its images of drones and helicopters looming over the desert, watching over the mining of minerals for some distant power, the film compels us to ask, are we here in the planet of Arrakis? Or are we in Iraq? The director uses the sci-fi genre to expose and force us to sit in the derealizing and dehumanizing gaze of a war on terror built not on liberation, but on exploitation. The series, based on a novel by Frank Herbert, follows Paul Atreides, the son of a duke charged by an emperor to manage the production of a precious mineral known as the spice on a desert planet. After grand betrayals that leave his father killed and his family on the run, Paul will eventually come to lead indigenous resistance fighters against the emperor's regime. Next slide. And to sense its naked repulsion towards such imperialism, let's take a look at this scene where the wounded Baron bathes himself in a healing salve in what looks like to me black oil. Please.
We chased them into a Coriolis storm. Winds at 800 kilometers an hour. Nothing survives such a storm. They're dead. It's a certainty.
So it's done, finally. Sent word to Katie Prime to begin selling our spice reserves. But slowly. We don't want the price to fall. You have no idea how much it cost me to bring such a force to bear here. No, I only have one requirement. Income. So squeeze rabbit. Squeeze hard.
Yes, Uncle. And the vermin.
Kill them all.
Here, we have an image of a white, even albino figure, dipping his body in oil. He speaks with the abject cruelty of a capitalist interested only in the bottom dollar, telling his terrified vassal, quote, "We don't want the price to fall. I have one requirement, income," end quote. As he dunks his head back into the liquid, speaking of the indigenous population, he offhandedly orders, quote, "Kill them all," end quote. The indigenous population of the desert means nothing to this merchant of spice, or as the staging forcefully suggests, petrol. Only what lies under their feet matters. The scene is striking because of how explicit and grotesque it is about a commercial attitude towards an exploited and far-off land. One where the imperialists are ready to go to war and are ready to exterminate. The iconography back to Iraq reminds us that this is a film very much imagining a kind of corporate entity like the oil company Halliburton, using the sci-fi genre to highlight the human toll when the war and industrial machine come together. Within this setting, we have Paul, the imagined prophet for the film's desert people, the Fremen. While the film has been criticized for co-opting Arab and Islamic culture without casting anyone of a North African background, it is still very intriguing to see how the film is inviting us to take on the resistant logic of a Near Eastern coded indigenous population that is being exploited. So remember how far we have gone from the Arab terrorists without real convincing political conviction of United 93. Next slide. In the scene depicting the mining of the desert, which corresponds with Paul's first encounter with the desert landscape, a Fremen ally to the Duke is inspired by Paul's presence and recites a verse of their faith. As the desert, through a giant sandworm we see above there, destroys an apparatus designed to extract the spice, we see the silhouette of Paul in the foreground and hear the words, quote, "Bless the maker and his water. Bless the coming and going of him. May his passage cleanse the world and keep the world for his people." End quote. The film then cuts to the below low-angle shot of Paul looking out at an imperial apparatus being disrupted. The cut formally suggests that he is going to help this people keep their world. In the second film, Paul, now a freedom fighter, attacks the emperor. Next slide. Look at this image here. Heavily featured in the film's advertising, where Paul stands looking at the destruction, and we viewers, through the camera, quite literally stand behind him. In many ways, the film is performing very destabilizing work, asking us to sympathize with those who would be considered in one light to be terrorists. It reveals, as I argue throughout my book, the importance of such a spectacle to critique. Each Cedric argues that our attentions are misdirected if we only work to uncover invisible state violence. Instead, Cedric writes, more focus needs to be placed on, quote, forms of state violence that are hypervisible from the start, which may be offered as an exemplary spectacle, end quote. We need new ways, Cedric argues, quote, to displace and redirect, as well as expand our aperture of visibility, end quote, to change our perspective. These films, taken in their totality, work to change our perspective, bringing us even within the violence to understand those dubbed the enemy, along with our own intimacy with both victims and perpetrators. We may find ourselves standing behind both. Paul's mother becomes a spiritual leader within the revolution, drinking some distilled liquid from the sandworm and going on a vision quest. Afterwards, she begs Paul to also drink the liquid, the so-called water of life. Next slide. Then your mind is going to open, and you will see. She switches to the Fremen language before making her final declaration toward Paul and toward the camera, toward us. You will see the beauty and the horror, end quote. This is the dichotomy that the blockbuster lingers within, so exhilarating and so unsettling at the same time. Within beautiful special effects, within awe-inspiring explosions, we may find the horrors in a time marked by policies and by dehumanizations of the post-9/11 world. Such a film forces us to linger in the strangeness of an era marked by what Bush administration officials briefly described at the beginning of the Iraq War as, quote, shock and awe, end quote. The phrasing, according to its inventor, Harlan Ullman, refers to a strategy designed to overcome the enemy with, quote, paralysis, impotence, and a feeling of helplessness, end quote. Using hard power, in this case, instead of soft power, it was designed as a strategy of, quote, influencing, affecting, and controlling Iraq will and perception, end quote. The awe that followed targeted attack was, quote, awe that was the inoculation that made the effects on will and perception lasting, end quote. Such films, produced by Hollywood, are, I find, a form of shock and awe. However, if we look closely at their surface, really closely, we can begin to scratch it. We can begin to pull at the ideological seams, we begin to see the horror that underlies the beauty. To sit not with Iron Man, but the Afghani boy who looks at the drone-like superhero in terror after he kills all the hostage takers. How a Muslim American superhero might speak to the normalization of a military surveillance apparatus. And in the case of Paul Atreides, who, I must reveal to you, ends up becoming emperor at the end of the second film, how our fight for an anti-colonial future might be merely co-opted by an empire through its celluloid dream factory to plant its tendrils into our hearts and minds. Next slide. Now you might be saying, Fareed, where lies the hope for us as we seek to understand this strange new world, to see this truth behind destructive representations of Arabs, Muslim, and all those labeled enemy? For me, I think the hope lies in how such films allow us to reflect upon ourselves, on our prejudices, our positionality, and perhaps most crucially, our appetites. I don't think it is a coincidence that the Emperor's spaceship in Dune, which we see here, is a mirrored sphere, a sphere that distorts the desert landscape. I find that it's a perfect embodiment for such films. They give us a place for distorting, beautiful, and horrifying reflection. In their intrigue and in their excitement, they tempt us and remind us that we should not look away from what we would prefer not to see. In our times of grand, overwhelming, and yes, indeed, spectacular violence, that is one lesson we should all remember. Next slide. Thank you so much for your kind attention. I look forward to your question. Here's a discount code from my press. If you, I'm sorry for being a peddler at this point and not a poet, but there's the discount code, and there are many ways you can contact me. I hope that we can keep the conversation going. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fareed, for that excellent talk. And I think all your impersonations are exactly accurate. So I think you have a second career in that for sure. We have just a little bit of time for question and answer. We want to keep it brief. We don't want to keep it too long. So what we're going to do, Jennifer, Lou over here, and myself have some index cards and pens. So if you have a question, think of a question, raise your hand. I'm going to give you an index card and a pen. Write it down. I'm going to collect them real quick, and then we're going to choose a few of them. All right? We're not going to be able to do all of them probably, but please don't hesitate. Would anyone like a card?
Yeah, I'll take any thoughts and questions you may have.
Anyone else? Okay. Yes, I'll get you started. Okay. Fareed, in your book, No Jurisdiction, one thing I rather liked was you spent some time talking about different, I guess we'll call them American film genres, like there's the Western, the film noir, and I think you sort of juxtapose these, right? And talk about the villain in those and other things. I'm wondering, is the problem of Hollywood film that there are too many limits for the kind of atmospheres that we have? And I wonder if a lot of these mischaracterizations and stereotypes and so on of the, let's call it the Arab other, if those are coming out of this sort of fixed recycling over and over again within, what the Western can do or what the film noir can do. Thinking of Batman is a good example you use a lot in the book No Jurisdiction. Maybe you want to speak to those of us who are not as acquainted with film studies, what those genres are about and what is expected of those genres.
Thank you for the question. I think for me, the thing about genres our expectations, and yet they demand that many of our expectations are met. You know, when you go to a horror movie and you're like, that's not what I wanted. You know, it's a dangerous line, and I think it speaks to the problem of what David was referring to as limits. So in some ways, a Western is always going to promise you expansive vistas, right? A film noir is always going to demand shadow, you know, those deep, shadowy cities of like The Big Sleep or, you know, the Humphrey Bogart movies, and the strong, dangerous sexual women, the femme fatale. They're always going to have these demands. Superheroes are always going to, movies will always have a clash between a villain, a supervillain, and a superhero. But for me, what's so exciting, especially since we're all interested in troubling preconceptions, is I think the very limits of genre are very exciting because we have set expectations. There's abilities to play with what we expect in subtle but powerful ways. So for instance, in The Dark Knight, to give you an example, the Joker is being beat by Batman. He's literally being tortured in a police station. And if you see how the camera is working, the camera captures Batman from a low angle, like we saw Paul Atreides, a hero. And it captures the Joker from a high angle, like a villain, small. But the Joker pushes up off the ground, laughing, and goes, "There is nothing you can do. Nothing you can do to me with all your strength." And I think it's such a powerful moment because it's like high angle, low angle, bad Batman, you know, I mean bad as in true, you know, like powerful Batman, weak villain. But I think in that space, there's a lot of place to play with expectation. So my thinking, David, and maybe this is naive, maybe a retort could be, Fareed, you're trying to save bad objects. You're trying to save objects that traffic in your own dehumanization. But for me, I find that these forms are so powerful because those set expectations always demand disruption, always demand something new. And I think in those spaces, we can start to find different possibilities for empathy. I'm curious, David, does that read as naive to you?
Yeah, that's good. I appreciate it. I'm getting a lot of questions that are aiming towards your biography and why you got interested in film. So I think I could bring some of these questions together.
Sure.
Questions to the fact of, well, here's a very specific one. What movie or movies impacted you at age 12? So I have to remember exactly 12, not 13, not 11. But what were the formative experiences of film for you, and do those sorts of things still speak to you?
Absolutely. My tastes have been called by a late best friend of mine in Sydney, Montana. His name was Randy, and he said, "Fareed, your tastes are as consistent as the Rock of Gibraltar." And that's all I was going to say. The things I loved when I was 3, Batman, I still love him now. Batman. You know, and so I can actually, I'll just note very briefly to that, I think, very powerful question. I'll bring it actually back to 12. Set your eyes back, pre-9/11, everyone. The internet is just getting started. It's 1999. And there's this film that came out called The Matrix. Baba, you remember, you brought me to the film. And I remember watching this film about a reality that looks perfect on the surface, but underneath hides a real world. And I remember being delighted and shocked and astounded by the idea that under the surface, there's something true. Under a facade, there's something that unsettles. And so for me, The Matrix, at age 12, was a film that I found spoke to this vision that was already cooking in my mind, but which was maybe formalized by the movie. A demand that we approach the beautiful, the ideal, with a skepticism, looking at different darker notes. And I would say, in the spirit of, since our friend Batman is right there, just going back to age 3, and in Sydney, Montana, I felt very isolated. I think as someone with a disability, from an immigrant background, non-white, I never really was accepted, at least in my own mind. Who knows, maybe they all rose me on their shoulders. But in my own mind, I never felt like this was the right for me. Like when we went to brandings and my sisters would carry I think that some of them are watching. Hello. Some of my sisters would carry around bull testicles, from the branding. And I just remember telling my parents, I just want to go home and go back to the sofa. Let me go back to the sofa. And my parents would be like, Fareed, you got to stay here for a few hours. But I remember at age 3, I got my VHS copy of Batman 1989. I don't know if you've seen the movie, but it has Gotham City. And for me, it was such a space of wonderful escape. It had the dark shadows that even as a young boy, and I watched the film a lot, so I'm sure my thoughts continued to marinate over this, but even as a young boy, I felt like, oh man, not only is there a space that's grander and bigger than these wide open and empty plains, there's a place where the shadows are explicit, where the shadows I feel in my heart when I'm in Sydney, Montana, where I don't feel entirely accepted, again, at least in my own mind. There's a place where those shadows can be spread, can be seen, and can be felt, and can be touched. And I think those kind of very early examples with encounters with Gotham City, with a place where darkness could not only be touched, but in some ways was privileged by its hero and by the setting, for me was really exciting and really transformative. But thank you all for the question.
Another question here. Someone in our audience has asked a question about the portrayal of Muslims or Arabs outside of Hollywood and other film crucibles. In particular, do you have any interest in this in Bollywood, or if not Bollywood, maybe some other region that you would like to speak to?
Absolutely. I think, unfortunately, when you study global film as I do, I'm omnivorous. So when we talk later or when you write to me, please give me all your recommendations. I eat it all from everywhere around the world. But it's all to sort of say you develop certain dead angles, David, where you're like, wait. And one of those is, for me, South Asian cinema, unfortunately. So if you have recommendations, it's interesting. South Asian cinema, some examples I know, do traffic in the Bollywood sphere. They do traffic in representations of the Muslim as enemy. So very resonant in some ways with some Hollywood examples. I know of certain films, I think Karnan is one of them. But a film of a national cinema I can speak to more is French cinema, which for me, as someone with a French-Arab background, it's in French cinema where I actually see people like me. People that are between those worlds. You're never going to see a lot of French Arabs in Hollywood cinema. it just won't be there. But it's in something like, French cinema where you're going to see French subjects who are navigating their, am I North African? Am I Muslim? Am I French? What does that look like? And for me, that's why I think it's so important for us to always extend our eye if we can. I love Hollywood. I wish we could all go to the movies together. But like Hollywood, in addition to that diet, I think looking at different national cinemas, even if we are not French Arab, provides nuance to understand specific alienations and specific kinds of discourses and prejudices. So absolutely this resonates. And I will sort of say that if people are interested in a cinema that, by and large, and you can see it in films like La Haine or Hate, and some of the more recent films that I'm working on that look at the terrorist moment in France now, especially a film called November, named after the November attacks, you're going to find really interesting, resonant in some ways to Hollywood, but there is much more acknowledgement of colonial history, and there's much more wrestling with mixed populations in the community that I think are really interesting, that definitely go beyond or speak with very different nuance to the Muslim experience than Hollywood cinema, which, except for these exceptions, you saw everyone, I spent a good deal on Paul Atreides, on a metaphoric representation of Arab or Muslim culture. So definitely I think French cinema is an exciting way to explore those questions more deeply. And I would just ask everyone, if you have recommendations for me on this issue of representations of Arab or the Muslim populations across the world, I'd love to hear them.
I have a similar question, and for time's sake, I think we'll make this the last question. again, back to outside of Bollywood,
Please.
and looking at other examples. So now a question more widely about media. So don't have to focus on film for this if you don't want to, but just as in recent years we've seen a kind of widening, expanding of, through the internet, of the way we get news. So we no longer have just 3 or 4 major news outlets on television giving us, more or less the same story, but we have, sort of widening out into a Wild West in some ways of how we get our news sources and other information. So it seems to me that also we are, I think, in addition to Hollywood, there are people who, certainly in American culture, who are interested in non-Hollywood films. And I have students, for instance, that have Bollywood collections and other sorts of collections. But I think also the independent film has become, I think, quite a popular thing, at least for college students. I see that. How do you think that is affecting these sorts of challenges of the depiction of the Arab other? Do you think that they're very much the same problems, or do you think that it's worse, better? What do you think?
I don't think, I think what's so exciting to hear about how your students are taking this is that David made a very sharp point in that my focus is often on Hollywood, at least in this talk. But I think you're right, like independent cinema, and I would sort of say independent cinema not only for Arab American representation, but for a lot of representation outside of the normative, including sexuality, et cetera. You're going to find a lot more to dig into, or at least to go beyond the archetype. A lot of Marvel movies, as sometimes you're watching these big productions, which I very much enjoy, but you sometimes wonder, like, wait, are we really exploring this issue of diversity or of this type of representation, or are we just saying, hey, look, everyone, there's a Muslim person, done and done, which is not the richest. So I would say, like, independent cinema, absolutely, and I would highlight for everyone, if are you getting a little hungry to watch a movie now? That's my hope. At the very least, I hope you walk away being like, I want to watch a movie. And if that's the case, I'd recommend one film that came out fairly recently. It's a comedy. And it's odd to call it like a post-9/11 comedy, but it's a film about a queer community or queer household apartment building in New York, and it's called Stress Positions. Speaking to the very dark humor of the film, stress positions is euphemistic language for torture. But in this film, Stress Positions, we have interactions of people that are mixed race, Arab and Muslim Americans, dealing with queerness, as well as dealing with a post-9/11 surveillance apparatus, which you'll see often in Hollywood. It's very spectacular. I'd recommend Sicario for a type of really impressive vision of that. But it's bringing all of that to deal with this particular story of these non-normative identities, of these people caught between worlds. That's really exciting, and I think in so many ways, going in very different, whether it's better or worse, going in very different places and able to go maybe with more depth to these kinds of idiosyncratic intersections of identity. So yes, absolutely, I think American independent cinema, for those who are hungering for more, will offer a depth of representation while still playing in these same hyper-surveyed and paranoid worlds that we live in the War on Terror, that I think could be really exciting to further explore.
Well, thank you very much for your excellent talk, and I hope that you will all join us. We have refreshments outside, and Fareed will be there, happy to meet you in person. You could get a copy of his book if you like, and he'd be happy to sign it for you. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you so much.